Welcome. Thank you for joining us online from Tokyo. We have with us today a wonderful guest from the University of Oxford in the UK, Rana Mitter, who has written several books that have marked their time, as the French would say. And the most recent one, called China's War with Japan, about the Second World War, which came out a couple of years ago, was fantastically reviewed, won prizes. It was very exciting. And today we're going to use that basically as a launch pad for talking about history in Asia and how history comes back in different forms, how it's reinterpreted or interpreted, and how it marks countries still today. And I thought we'd start, Rana, by asking you about the colonial period, which your family was originally from Bengal. The Brits held sway there for 2 centuries. And also, their hometown, Calcutta, was really the cradle of Indian nationalism. So a town that's very marked, a city actually, very marked by history, I found when I used to visit it quite often. So I had not expected when I came to Asia, which I thought of above all as economically dynamic, hopeful, on its way to the future, so to speak, that history would run as deep as it seems to in different forms in different countries. But it seems to have marked much of Asia quite deeply. And I wanted to ask you to start out with where your interest in history sprang from, and to what extent in your work it provokes you to think about Asia today as well.
David, thank you very much for actually a very stimulating question. It's a particular pleasure to be able to answer it here in Tokyo at the UNU, because we're sitting right now in a city which has had its own share of history. Certainly in the 20th century, a lot of that history has been traumatic. It's been in some ways dramatic as well. And I think it gets to those core underlying issues that I think stimulated me to think about history in Asia, more broadly speaking. I've tended to specialize in the history of China and also Japan to some extent. But one thing I've realized is that those threads in individual countries can't be separated from the region and its wider history. And also some themes which I think are rather appropriate to the mission of your own institution here at the UNU, because issues of justice, international justice, reconciliation, and also a sense that the past informs the goals of the present are very much with us in Asia today. So let me give an example of what I'm talking about. Now, you mentioned the dynamism, the economic dynamism of Japan, China today. And I think, when we think about some of the statistics that, if you include India, 75% of the world's population lives in the Greater Asia region, maybe that's something close to 75% of the world's economy, maybe based here in the not so distant future. And yet, all of that happened very quickly. If you went back even 30 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. And 70 years ago, at the ending of World War II, huge amounts of this region, of this continent, were devastated by the impact of war, by the impact of bombing, and of course of mass refugee flight, migration, the partition in India, which my own parents, of course, growing up in the last generation of colonial subjects, you might say, in India. I mean, they were a little young to be involved in the independence movement themselves, but they remember it, and they were very much shaped by that experience. So I think as a historian, when I want to think about China, not a country with which I have any personal connection through family. I mean, I'm of Indian background, but some of the stories, some of the underlying themes seem to me similar in India, in China, and even in Japan, which is a region of the world which had been very much impacted by colonialism in the 19th and early 20th century. The idea that one part of the world, the Western world, had had both technological and military and political capacity to conquer, and in some ways both change and at times devastate the region, but also change its fate very fundamentally. And thinking about, why parts of this region went to war with each other, as well as fighting for independence against the colonial powers that controlled so much of it, I think we come back over and over again to this question of different peoples finding different goals. So whether it's the goal of creating a nation state, creating economic prosperity, or trying to find a new sense of identity. All of these things, I think, are very common in the shared history of Asia in this region. And one of the ironies is that many of Asia's peoples were actually fighting each other, often in service of similar goals.
And one thing that is interesting is that the history that's being written today is rather different than the history that was being written 30 years ago. There's much more interest, it seems to me, amongst historians, also political scientists probably, in the legacy of that colonial era when the influence of the West, and often more than the influence of the West, the jackboots of the West, were on this area. Today there's a sense that history does run quite deep in Asia. It's a surprise, I think, to many people. There have been several good books, including particularly your most recent one on the topic, and that as has been the case in Europe historically quite a lot, history can be politics. Indeed, the European Union is an effort to try to overcome history being politics.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right, David. One of the things that it strikes me when we think about the period, for instance, of the Second World War, is that to some extent it's a historical phenomenon in Europe. The European Union, although of course at the moment it's going through some difficult times, was a broadly successful attempt to try and contain the demons of the past. Now, I'd say that in many ways the legacy of World War II in Asia is still very much current affairs. So if we think about things that we rip from the headlines today, whether it is the legacy of sex slavery carried out by the Japanese army in China and Korea, the so-called comfort women issue, that's still very much with us in the year 2017. Or if we turn to India and a question of how that particular country is moving out into a more kind of global and dynamic atmosphere, and yet in many ways is still tied to the history of figures like Nehru, like Gandhi, and also more controversial figures like Subhas Chandra Bose, the independence fighter for India's freedom who fought with the Japanese rather than with the Allies during World War II. These are all figures who are still very much thought of as part of a current conversation. I mean, if we think of a comparison with somewhere like Britain, obviously everyone knows who Winston Churchill is, but I would say that he's probably not someone who people refer to on a daily basis these days in conversation, except possibly some of our more nostalgic ministers. I think if we think about the historical figures of Asia, Chairman Mao Zedong, the figures perhaps who ran Japan, not just in the war, but immediately afterwards, Yoshida Shigeru, the great post-war prime minister who helped to shape a democratic and American-oriented Japan, or indeed a figure like Gandhi. All of these, I think, are still part of the conversation in Asia today, and that's why understanding the history behind them is so important.
And in India, at least, and I'm sure in China and Japan too, history is constantly being reevaluated. You mentioned Bose as a very interesting historic figure who nobody much discussed when I was young, who not only is discussed a lot, debated a lot today in India as a good thing or a bad thing, but I'd say whose stock has risen quite a lot in India in my time of knowing the country. So just in a period of the last 15 years, a figure who was seen as pretty marginal, I think, when I first came to India, has come to be seen as a major figure, a respectable figure, and a figure that has his place in the pantheon of worthy Indian subjects of history.
Absolutely. I mean, my family, part of my family has a background in Calcutta, a wonderful and historically extremely resonant city. And I think it's fair to say that maybe 30 years ago, Subhas Chandra Bose, this figure, was not perhaps widely talked about. Even then you could go, as you can today, to his old house.
Which I did.
So I hope you saw some of the relics that were left there. And, you know, a fascinating figure. He fought on the Japanese side in World War II, but his Indian National Army, which he raised, had all sorts of very interesting and in many ways progressive features. He was very against communalism, so he had a Muslim as a second in command. He also, of course, commanded a female regiment, the Rani of Jhansi regiment, which was very unusual in those days. So, you know, not necessarily a typical figure in terms of the wider history of the period. But let's be honest, the fact that he fought on the side of the Axis and not the Allies has tarnished his historical reputation for a long time. Nowadays in Bengal, in Calcutta, they seem to have got past that in a big way. You find pictures of him all over the place, and he's being used as a sort of touchstone figure, a figure who in many ways embodies not his collaboration with the Japanese, but rather a story about Indian independence, which isn't just about the better-known figures, the Nehrus, the Gandhis, but also about a wider understanding. But just to show that Asia is complex in the way it deals with its history, I want to just contrast it for one moment with another figure, perhaps one who is not as well known in the English-speaking world, and that's a man named Wang Jingwei. Now, 70 years ago, he was a very well-known figure in China in particular, because he was actually designated as the spiritual heir, you might say, of Sun Yat-sen, the great Chinese nationalist who, of course, was the key figure of the Chinese Revolution that overthrew the emperor in 1911, 1912. Now, to fast forward the story, Wang Jingwei, through a series of historical circumstances, ended up running a Japanese-sponsored, Japanese client government during World War II in China. Some people who know French history have compared him with a figure like Pétain or Laval.
Yeah.
I think if people, perhaps even subject themselves to reading my book about the war in China, will see that in some ways he was a tragic and in some ways quite ambiguous figure. But the fact is that if you mention his name in China today, people will respond with only one word, and that's the word traitor. He is still regarded as someone in China today who betrayed China's national mission because he collaborated with the Japanese during that time. And I think it's very interesting that in the present day, 7 decades later, Subhas Chandra Bose is now rehabilitated as a national hero, and certainly a Bengali regional hero in India, whereas Wang Jingwei is still the name that cannot be spoken in China. Two different countries, similar histories in one sense, but very different endpoints.
Indeed. Now, coming to today, we're at a moment, I think, of some nervousness in Asia, as elsewhere in the world, because several developments last year have introduced wild cards. Brexit, in a way, was the first significant one, but the election of Donald Trump in the United States, who has sought, actually, to create the prospect of shaking up seriously American policy on virtually every front, foreign policy, economic, social. These raise all sorts of uncertainty in Asia, even though what goes on in Europe and the United States, in one sense, should not matter all that much. So in that sense, is there a burden of history also? Does the United States, does Europe continue to inhabit Asia up to a point?
I think the historical implications of the moment we're in now are fascinating. And one thing if I had a time machine, I'd love to fast forward 50 years and look back at what 2016, 2017 really meant in terms of global politics. And even in the few days I've been here in Tokyo, with a chance to talk to a few people who work in policy here in Japan, a country which will be very affected by these developments, I've heard every opinion from the Trump presidency as a turning point that will change everything in Asia to actually business as usual, and it'll just be a variation of the same. So we'll have to, I'm sure it won't take 50 years, but in a year from now, we may know a lot more. But let me say something about that historical framework that you mentioned, because I think that is a very important way to consider what's been changing here in Asia. In some ways, since 1945, every single president of the United States has had the same attitude to East Asia. Now, that's an outrageously broad statement, but I'm going to stand by it a little bit, because what I mean by that is that a framework that was set up in the immediate aftermath of World War II has, very broadly speaking, been maintained one way or another. obviously with some significant variations. The institution which underpins where we are now, the United Nations, made, in my opinion, actually, a mistake by not incorporating the People's Republic of China quite early on in the history of the Cold War. I think it was a historical opportunity which was missed at that time for reasons that both the United States and China have to take some of the blame. I think it's not a historical fault that it lies on one side or the other, but on both. So there were changes like the entry of China to the UN in the early 70s, which obviously changed the ground
Indeed,
rules.
the entry of Japan in the 1950s changed something.
Absolutely, and making Japan absolutely a firm ally of the liberal world. I don't like the term the Western world because I don't like the idea that these values are in any sense geographically bounded. So let's call it the liberal world. From the late 1940s, early 1950s onwards, up to the present day, I think it's fair to say that the idea that the United States has been there as one of a set of pillars or support points for a particular sort of structure here in Asia, in which there is a commitment beyond the purely military that underpins the region with certain values about an international order that's stable, liberal ideas on trade and on politics. Now, the United States, like any other major power, is obviously prone on occasion to deep hypocrisy. We all know that all sorts of rather nasty regimes, Taiwan, South Vietnam, South Korea before democratization, were also supported by the US and were not always very pretty to look at. But the fact is that in the last 25 years or so, there has been a genuine deepening of democratization, liberalization, and free trade in this region as a whole. And Republican or Democrat, all presidents, I think, have underpinned that in one way or another. We don't yet know, we're talking, a few days before President-elect Trump becomes the President of the United States. And he's made statements in the last half year or so that maybe some traditional US allies in the region, South Korea, Japan, might have to look after their own defense more than they have done. Might have to pay for it, might have to arrange it. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was intended to create a new free trading environment between the US and many actors in the region, looks as if it may be torn up on the table in the US and left aside. Maybe an opportunity for China, the rising power in the region, to go ahead with its own idea of RCEP, the Regional Common Economic Partnership. We'll see if the rhetoric in the campaign is actually measured up in the reality. One thing we do know from previous presidents is that not everything people say in campaigns necessarily happens in reality. But I would add one historical point at the end of my thought here, which is that we do know that back in the 1930s, this region, like Europe, suffered from a variety of political decisions that turned out to be disastrous. Ones where politics and economics turn inward in a variety of countries, where people turned to military solutions that were not thought through in international organizations. The League of Nations, predecessor to the UN, turned out to be inadequate to many of the great causes at the time. Although one of the interesting things that historians have been doing in the last 15 years is actually looking at the positive side of the League of Nations.
Indeed.
Looking at the way in which its economic development and the way in which
There's a very good book of history on all of that last year, I think.
I think there are several, including one by my colleague at Oxford, Patricia Clavin, about rethinking the world economy, showing that actually the League of Nations did do an awful lot of good. But the fact is that we know that World War II did break out, partly because of failures in that system. I think we would be grossly betraying our knowledge of history and also present generations if we didn't pay attention to those lessons and make sure that Asia and the wider world does not go down that path again.
Indeed. Well, Rana, thank you very much. For those of us joining us online, we wish you could be here tonight in Tokyo. I think we're going to have a very active conversation with our audience. Asia is just a tremendously kinetic continent at the moment. Japan is a terrific country for UNU to be headquartered in. It gives us access, not least, quite easily to so many other fascinating Asian places as well as Japan. We're very grateful to you, Rana, for having come this very long way for our conversation this evening, and also for joining us online for a little bit to give an idea of the sorts of things we'll be discussing this evening.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, David, and it's a real pleasure.